the key matchups, the names to know on both sides. I know that Michigan has a few injury concerns, like Penn State. Jim Harbaugh isn't exactly open about who's available, who's 100%, who's not. Pretty tight to the vest there. But outside of Will Johnson, the other boundary cornerbacks have at least question marks of their availability. They didn't know if they were going to have them going into Purdue, and that's Penn State. They don't know if they're going to have Trey Wallace, so it's almost like an eye for an eye in this case. The number 2, the number 3 cornerbacks for Michigan. Penn State's clear-cut number 2 wide receiver, even though Dante Cephas is emerging, but through the entire offseason, and even still to this point, James Franklin hasn't openly, I want to say, sung the praises of Dante Cephas, because it's always been Keandre Lambert-Smith and Trey Wallace. Every single time you ask him, hey, what's the progress in the wide receiver room? It's Wallace and KLS. Stop asking me, right? It's the same answer every single time for the past 6 months, it seems to be. So I feel like Will Johnson versus KLS is a big matchup, and then keeping an eye on the health of Michigan's other cornerbacks.
Well, and I tell you what, Michigan, they've really impressed me all season long with their defensive backs. I actually like Mike Sainristil, the best back there. He's just kind of a ball hawk no matter who else is out there, whether he's usually a nickel back, so he comes in those situations. I think the key, the biggest player coming back, and maybe you can tell me, I think Chop Robinson's getting ready. He's going to come back in this game. Is he not? Is that the case?
He will. He practiced in full. He did dress for Maryland, even though he was inactive and didn't really go through all of the warmups. I think that might have been for formality. He did, he played at Maryland. He played at that College Park football stadium. That was a big deal for him to miss that game. But he practiced in full. There were no limitations for him. There were no limitations for Amin Vanover as well. But on the offensive side of things, because Penn State's problem isn't the defense, and they've shown that they can succeed without Chop Robinson. They still held Ohio State in check, even when both of those guys went down for injury. Robinson left fairly, not early in the game, but about halfway through. And Penn State still held an Ohio State offense up until the Marvin Harrison Jr. touchdown. They held them in the teens. So and 1.9 yards per carry, mind you, as well. So you lose 2 defensive linemen who are very good at stopping the run, and Ohio State only gets 1.9 yards per carry. But I get it. 418 for Michigan. 418 from last year. I get it.
Yeah. While you're sitting there talking about that, I was thinking of another matchup that I think is worthy of watching. I assume Kalen King's going to be Oliver Roman Wilson. Roman Wilson is he's all of a sudden, when they're in trouble, JJ McCarthy just finds him in the end zone. I think he's got like 10 touchdowns already this year. And but Kalen King, he's going to be playing on Sundays as well. I'd be interested if that was the one-on-one matchup or whether they're going to move people around or not. At the end of the day, Zach, I think that both teams will come out here and they will try and take advantage of their running backs. You got 4 of the best running backs in the country with
all NFL running backs.
Of course, you got Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, and I just think both teams will try to establish that in the get-go and in the early going. And when they do, I expect a lot of 9, 10, 12 play drives. Well, not a lot, a significant amount. And, if you have a lot of those, that kind of shortens the game. That's less possessions later on. So right now, I'll tell you, I think it's going to be a lower scoring game. I think the over-under is around 45. I don't think it'll hit that because I think both sides will have some pretty healthy, lengthy drives, ball control, all that. And, JJ McCarthy, he can hit anybody at any place in the field if he needs to go to the passing game. That's the thing that makes Michigan so tough. And I think the shame of all this Spygate stuff that's going on. Well, they started winning 2 years ago when the spying was allegedly going on. And you look at this roster, man, it is good enough to win against.
Did they need it all along
without any help whatsoever? So, and look, I think Drew Aller's a pretty accurate quarterback too. They kind of keep him, on a short leash. They don't have the deep threat. They don't throw deep a lot. I still laugh at the press conference that was, I think, 3 weeks ago. Hey, James Franklin, when you guys going to just start chucking it down the field for the heck of it? And he just kind of laughed. I think we had talked about that because I think that had just happened right when I talked to you last. And, but I do think they need to have a little more explosiveness. I do think Drew Aller's accurate enough to put the ball pretty much wherever it needs to go. I don't know if he's
Mhm.
as accurate as JJ McCarthy, but McCarthy's a little older and a lot more experienced. But
Yep.
I think it's going to be a ground and pound, old fashioned Big Ten football game for the most part. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Well, it depends what Penn State. I was waiting for Penn State. I almost thought that they were in a position like Ohio State and Michigan have in the past where they could conceal some more of their bread and butter plays. But yeah, it kind of caught with my hand in the cookie jar here is that that was not the case. Because if Penn State had that situation, they would have ran it against Ohio State. And instead of opening up their playbook, it feels like they scaled it back because not everybody was available. In Penn State's case, they're actually very healthy. Offensive line, they're bumps and bruises, of course. Everybody's bruised up at this
Yeah.
point, Craig. We all know that. Michigan's got bumps and bruises, but for Penn State, you would think that maybe two offensive linemen would be missing, or maybe some of the depth had taken a hit. Penn State's got all of its offensive linemen available. Crazy enough, and that's what all that work has gone into with James Franklin and offensive line coach Phil Troutwine. Running backs are very healthy, and that's why Penn State has done what it's done in Michigan. Now, Ohio State has dealt with its fair share of injuries to the running back spot. But Michigan and Penn State don't have to burn the tread on the tires. And that's what James Franklin has said all along. We want both of our running backs to be healthy and fresh going into the fourth quarter because that's when it's most important. So the calls for, well, it should just be Katron Allen running the football 100% of the time because Nicholas Singleton can't get it done. I'd still argue that Nicholas Singleton is the best athlete on the offense anyway. Maybe the team,
Yeah.
maybe. That's up where there's Abdul Carter and Chop Robinson, right? I'm talking pure athlete. But on offense, it's Singleton. And I really want to see Penn State get creative and not just hand the football off with Singleton not getting a full burst, a full headed, a start, basically a start at the starting line there. And it almost seems like Singleton, who has that big play, that explosiveness, has lost a little bit of his confidence because he's not hurt, he's not banged up, he's perfectly fine. So what is it? It's got to be mental at this point. Coaches and players and teammates would never admit that. But I think when it's just not working the way it did a year ago and the whole sophomore slump thing, I look to Singleton to try to break open and have some of those, but that's coaching. So yes, it's going to be grounded or it's going to be ground and pound in a slugfest just by nature, Craig, because these two defenses analytically are 1 and 2 or
Yeah.
both in the top three, whichever rankings you look at. I've looked at all the numbers to see, and it's Penn State and Michigan. Michigan seems to be the consensus one. Penn State kind of cycles between 2, 3, but you're getting two top three defenses. So I imagine that and Michigan's not as good as they were at running the football last season. Last season, it was 6.5 yards per carry. This year, it's 4.5. That's a 2 yard drop off. And look at the competition they play.
I think that's a valid argument. And, people won't really be too startled looking at the stat. Most games, I mean, the yards per
Mhm.
carry is obvious, like you said. So it's almost 2 yards less. But Blake Corum hasn't really busted out with any 120-yard rushing games. He usually has them
No,
between 60 and 80. Donovan Edwards chips in a few, although Donovan Edwards hasn't been able to find the end
he's been
zone.
very
Usually, if we
quiet.
get
He's
down to
been
the
very quiet.
yeah. Yeah. But although they're almost to run a formula here. If they get down to the goal line, it's going to be Blake Corum. He gets in the end zone. I think he's got 16 touchdowns already
Yeah,
this
a
year.
lot.
Donovan's got one. I think Donovan's more shiftier. He's a guy that can come out of the backfield and catch a pass. But Blake Corum is their, pounded up to in between the tackles guy. But yeah, overall, it's funny. You look at the numbers with Michigan. And like I said, Blake Corum, if he rushes for 80 yards in a game, that's high this year. JJ McCarthy, if he doesn't have too many games where he throws too much over 200 yards. Now, a
Mhm.
lot of games they're sitting on the bench in the fourth quarter watching the second string in. There's no
Yep.
doubt that happens too. But
Yep.
if you go look, other than Roman Wilson with his 10 touchdowns and Blake Corum with his 16 touchdowns, if you look at yardage and all the other things across the board on the offense, nothing jumps out at you. It's just Michigan does whatever it needs to do in that moment. They need to run the
Mhm.
ball, they'll run the ball. If they need to go up tempo, they don't do that very often, by the way. They can. They're very slow and methodical for the most part. They use
Mhm.
up the play clock, they hand the ball off, and they're just like a tank that just runs through at a methodical pace for all four quarters. And that's how they win football games. But again, as I said a couple times earlier, they've been doing it against teams that are not nearly as good as Penn State. And I mentioned earlier how I think there'll be a lot of long drives, scoring drives, lower scoring game, less possessions. Yes, you also throw into the fact, as you mentioned, you have the top 2 defenses in the country working. It might be a little tougher to put those drives together. So either way, I'm taking a lower scoring game than we're used to with these teams. But yeah, you make a great point. The numbers are weird. Statistically, the numbers are weird. I think like people that talk about JJ McCarthy winning the Heisman, I don't, the numbers aren't there again, because he only plays about 3/4 a game, but maybe at the end of the day, people will say, well, he won. They had an undefeated season. They get to the playoffs. If that happens, maybe he'll get consideration then. But I know how media types are. The first thing they do, the people that vote and people maybe don't watch every game,
No.
they look at the stats. They look at the stats and they'll see a handful of quarterback, a ton of quarterbacks. Just go to the Pac-12. They all have like 3 times as many touchdowns as JJ McCarthy has this year. So the Heisman's a discussion for another day. But yeah, Michigan's very methodical in whatever weapons they choose to use.